welcome everyone to the Mind the Accent Gap webinar. I'm Andy Webb. I'm the VP of Product at Define Crowd. I'm a passionate voice enthusiast. I'd probably even go as far as to say an evangelist. It's a little bit about me. I've worked in digital for the last 20 years. I came from a sort of a telco and a media background. And I first started working in speech and conversational AI about 4 years ago. Such was the conviction that I really had that this is going to be instrumental in the evolution of the internet and for the discoverability and the interaction of all digital services. I pivoted my entire career to come away and focus on it. I sort of left behind the glitz and glam of the media industry, the award ceremonies and black tie dinners, and came for an amazing trip back to sort of scale up life in Portugal. Endless sunshine, and I can honestly say I've never looked back since. I love working in this industry, and I passionately believe it's going to be a major part of the internet going forward. So today is going to be the first in a series of webinars Define Crowd hosts on this broad subject of AI. As we roll through the rest of the year, we'll be looking at a whole host of subjects relating to the AI industry and its current and future impact on society as well. The first of these that we're going to be talking about is a subject that's perhaps best viewed as a subset of a larger topic within AI, one that's really impacting both the adoption of AI by businesses and also introduces business risk into the operations of those that do. That subject, of course, is bias in AI. And today we're going to be talking about that subject in the context of speech technology. Specifically, the recognition problems our AI models face in understanding regional or non-native accents, the potential business risks that are associated with having underrepresentation in those data sets, the social impact, and of course, what we can do about it. But most of all, of course, we're here to answer your questions. So we have a Q&A box, and we'd be really grateful if you just fire those questions into the Q&A, and at the end of it, we'll come back to you and we'll have some of our experts can give you the answers to some of your questions. For those that have joined, we've got a fantastic giveaway too. 9 hours of Spanish accented English data, worth over $1,000. I thought it maybe $1 billion, who knows, but definitely worth over $1,000. I've got no idea how we were so generous. I'm guessing everyone will be back for the next webinar too. So all you budding data scientists, all your ML engineers out there, you can use this data set to be able to explore the accent gap that exists and the performance impact on your kind of like training your speech recognition models with the right data. All you have to do is register on the getdata.definecrowd.com website, and there's a blue bar right up at the top that says, get your data here and get your free data set here. Joining me today to talk about these challenges and to answer your questions on bias in speech and speech data sets are two of the brightest minds that we have. We have Dan Waldwins, our director for product for Define Data, which provides off-the-shelf data sets for speech recognition, for both like doing acoustic modeling and also for language modeling, and a variety of other data sets as well, but speech is the core focus. And we have Chris Shelby, our director of machine learning. So Dan, perhaps we could have a few words from you to introduce yourself to the audience and what really got you interested in speech. When and where was your kind of almost like lights on moment that made you think this was going to be something you wanted to invest your career in?
Thanks, Andy, for the way too generous introduction for starters. So as Andy mentioned, I'm Dan. I'm from Belgium, the Flemish-speaking part. I got interested in speech and language technology probably during my university studies in Belgium, which was now about, I'd say, 15, 16 years ago or so. I've always been tremendously interested in language in general. That was my first love, and technology as well. So during my studies of Germanic languages at the University of Leuven, I started to get more and more interested into the tech side of things as well. I started taking some courses in computational linguistics, and that is where I really made the connection between the two when I realized that, well, this is something that interests me enough to make a career out of, perhaps, and that's where it all started. At the time, it wasn't really that easy to get started in this field. We're talking now early 2000s, and especially in Belgium, there wasn't that much to do yet in this area. There was a little bit, but it was still very much a budding area of expertise. So I started first doing some actual software engineering for a couple of years. And then around 2008, I finally made the move to Portugal to dedicate myself 100% to this area.
That's great. Welcome. Chris, perhaps you could introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your background and tell us where your sort of speech story began, what you've been previously involved in within the speech and ML community, and the point that you really saw perhaps the industry start to sit up and take notice of speech. As you know, I know that you've been in it for quite some time.
Sure. I think probably pretty similar to Don, and probably in a similar time frame back before speech technology wasn't really a promising field. Most people probably told me to do something useful. But I powered on, and I was very much impressed by some great minds at The Ohio State University. Mary Beckman, Chris Brew, Detmar Moyos, and Eric Fossler, to name a few. And I just really wanted to get involved, especially in making machines talk, making machines understand what we have to say. And yeah, it seemed a lot like sci-fi at that point, but I think that it's grown a lot. I started in the industry in about 2007 when the IVR scene was very, very strong, but it really didn't go much beyond that. It was a lot of trying to replace the press the button, but usually pressing the button was better. So then around, I'd say 2015 or so is when things really started taking off with deep learning. And we really saw a lot of the impact of the work that we'd already done with the great resources that had been built. And it was really easy to make that transition. So yeah, I guess my real passion is, as always, still in feature engineering. I've been around to quite a few countries. It's fun that I see some familiar faces from some past lives in the chat room here. So that's always great. It's a small world, and we have a lot of really great and talented people here. So yeah, my real passion, I think, is still in feature engineering and statistical learning theory, which is, you know, basically trying to get the best out of the data that we have and finding the best data that we could possibly get to make our models better.
Great, thanks for the introduction. I have to say, I think my favorite thing ever is still when people say, "What do you do for a living?" And I say, "I help robots talk." Is definitely a winner. So today's topic, you know, really when we look at the evolution of digital over the past few years, conversational AI in particular has been establishing this kind of ever greater rise to prominence in digital services, from voice assistants to next generation IVR platforms. You know, conversational AI, it's in our homes, it's in our cars, it's on our phones, it's in our TVs, it's our laptops, it's just everywhere, and its ubiquity is kind of growing every day. It's really gone beyond that kind of nice to have feature into something that's actually now genuinely sought of as part of the buying process. And it actually forms a core part now of so many companies' customer experience. So the need to ensure that we have this fair and unbiased performance has increased dramatically. You know, the baseline benchmark of a minimum viable product within speech has really risen probably sort of like, you know, tenfold over the last few years. And in a world where sort of benchmarking now really exists for this technology, we can no longer kind of get away with a service that only serves a partial audience well. It's got to be better, and it's got to be broader than that. So in this digital world where all brands are now global brands and they're reflected on by global audiences, the need to address this challenge has kind of become paramount. So otherwise, organizations or product teams wishing to evolve their services to become interactive and discoverable through speech or conversational AI, not only face placing their service revenues at risk, but their brand reputation too. You know, your bot is reflective of your brand. So when it starts to discriminate, your corporate world starts to crumble around you a little bit more as well. So we're looking forward to getting into this topic now. Before we start, we just want to have a quick piece of technology before we get into the questions with the panelists. So we have a quick poll for you. It'd be grateful if you could just press the button. The first poll is basically for us to get to know you a little bit. How many non-native speakers do you sort of converse with during your working day? So, you know, here at Define Crowd, we have, you know, even though English is our main language, I would probably say, there's only about 3 English people who really exist within the company. We have about sort of like, probably 15 or 20 over in the United States as well. But the majority of people are non-native speakers here. So it's interesting to see how this reflects amongst our audience as well today. So we also have, as I said, a Q&A box for all of your questions. Please don't wait to the end to put there and wait to see if we answer it. Throw your questions into the Q&A box. It's down in the bottom right-hand side of your browser application. So please just use it, and we'll make sure that we can get our panelists to answer your questions and make sure they're covered during this webinar. So let's look at and start perhaps a little bit more at some of the philosophical questions first, Chris. Perhaps we could start with you. We're kind of like 3 nomadic travelers, right? None of us live in their native country. But sort of how would you describe your own accent? How do you feel it kind of relates to your identity? And have you ever had to really change the way that you talk to get one of these kind of pesky little robots to understand you?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest that I'm definitely in a privileged group. I hail from the Midwestern United States, which is what is generally termed as standard American English. So I've been very lucky in that. But I do have some accent twerks that if my accent wasn't so privileged, probably maybe would give some kicks there, which are real fun things like the Northern City vowel shift. So a good shibboleth from somebody from Northeastern Ohio would be the flashlight is in the basement, where I really raise my A's, and I definitely try to avoid that when I'm talking to a robot for sure. And I also do not have the caught merger, which appears along the especially in the southern United States, but most of the United States is pretty much catching up. And, things like that can make it a bit pesky for language models to have to deal with, but, not too bad.
And what about yourself, Dan? I mean, you're not really from the kind of like the privileged native English being your language. How have you found your experience with voice assistants over the years?
It's definitely improved a lot over the last couple of years. That has been very, very obvious to me. My accent is far from perfect. I realize this. I'm still struggling with the dental fricatives in the beginning of this and that. I can't get it right. And when I speak normally, I just don't do this correctly, I know. But nonetheless, it's amazing to see that over the last, let's say, 4 years, perhaps thereabouts, I can get almost anything to work when I'm using American English speech recognition. So that is actually amazing to see. And not just my particular pronunciation, it's also amazing to see that, for instance, named entities are being recognized more and better than ever before, right? This was a sore point for a very long time. And now with the massive amounts of data, training data that are being made available, probably daily updates to speech and language models, even those things like named entities are being recognized almost flawlessly. So I've definitely seen this improve tremendously over the years.
It's a really key point, isn't it? I mean, when these speech recognition systems start to fail, you're forced to talk in a way that isn't natural to yourself, or things that are specific to your culture or entities aren't really recognized. It starts to sort of strip people of their identity. It actually has this social impact. It reminds me very much of that Scottish people in a voice-activated elevator clip, which if you haven't seen on YouTube, highly recommended. Be the best 3-minute giggle for speech recognition you'll have for ages. So that actually serves as a great sort of segue for us into exploring this concept of sort of bias within speech. So Chris, perhaps you could sort of start, like, what are the different types of bias that we see existing within speech?
Yeah, we definitely, most of the recognition engines that we have these days, they were developed generally by white males from rich countries and things like that. So there's a lot of bias there, obviously. And usually you test it with the people that are closest before it starts actually becoming a real product. And now I think we're starting to see that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. As first of all, definitely gender bias. also age, socioeconomic factors as well. Even when you're developing corpora for models, it oftentimes is very difficult because it used to be back in the day we do scripted speech, and some people actually can't read, and so that makes things pretty difficult as well.
And Dan, out of those things that Chris just talked about, which ones would you say are really kind of emerging as problems with customers that they're really starting to sort of sit up and start to pay attention to? I mean, we'd all love a beautifully balanced data set that works from everywhere, but where are the problems really starting to surface a little bit with your kind of exposure with customers?
Well, it depends a little bit on the application. For instance, during my past, I've worked on an application that was a part of which was speech recognition for the elderly, right? And many people's voices don't change that much from, let's say, when they're 18 until quite a bit older, perhaps 50, 60, but from then onwards, the voice actually changes quite a bit. So if you're trying to build an application for the elderly, but you only have training data from people that are 18 years old, you're going to have a bad time and the application is not going to work properly. Now, mostly, most big applications, they are not specifically catered towards the elderly, and then other types of bias come to the forefront much more. I would say definitely the one that that Christopher mentioned, those are the big ones. Gender balance is something fairly easy to address, to get data from both genders. Age, somewhat a little bit more difficult, but accent and socioeconomic background, those are usually a lot more insidious and much more difficult to address, because there are many different aspects of language that depend or that vary wildly from region to region, right? I'm from the Flemish part of Belgium. My grandparents lived in a village about 10 miles away from my parents, and the accent or the dialect was quite different. So if you were to come up with a speech recognition engine for Flemish from Belgium that addresses all accents and all dialects, you know, you're up for a great, for a huge task.
So do you think that the market is starting to feel pressure to do this, or do you think they solved the problem for like most people like me now, so now it's moving on to other things, or do you think they're actually really starting to respond to these pressures within the market?
A little bit of both. I think it is an economic truth that companies need to make money, and so they'll focus mostly on the markets where the money is to be made, right? So American English is obviously one of the languages that has the most resources when it comes to speech. When I got really into the business, you also had a lot of talk about EFIGs, so English, French, Italian, German, Spanish, big economic powers in Europe. So those languages were getting a lot of attention at the time. And it's just the fact that those languages will be the first ones addressed just because there's a bigger market for them. But I also don't think that speech recognition is a solved problem by far, even for American English, even for the best of people that are free of any kind of you know, that don't fall into any minority that is not very well catered by the data. There's still lots of things to do there. So beyond that, there is of course also the fact that nowadays companies, not all of them, but many companies are becoming much more inclusive. So it's a combination, in my opinion, of the fact that yes, the bigger languages, they are so well served that you've reached a level that is acceptable, that can still be improved constantly, but that has reached a very high level of acceptance and very low word error rates, for instance. And that combines with the fact that companies become more and more aware of all kinds of bias, and they want to be more and more inclusive. And those things together over the last couple of years, mostly in my experience, have really resulted in much more attention from companies who are working in this space to improve their applications and to try and eliminate as much as possible bias towards basically anything that's biased against.
Yeah, I guess in an online world, we're just starting to see, all businesses and all brands really starting to receive much more immediate and much more kind of direct feedback than they've ever seen before. And that's naturally allowing things that probably didn't really traditionally happen too much for brand parts of the brand organization to start to really, force decisions down onto sort of products around their preparedness to be able to go to market a little bit. But Chris, there's kind of like both a human side to this problem, as Dan's just been discussing, but there's also kind of like a technology one. So from a technical view, machines don't really deliberately discriminate unless they're sort of like Terminator. But how do you sort of define the accent gap from a machine learning perspective? What's really going on under the hood?
Yeah, I'd say we're very far from Terminator, so no worries there.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely, I think that it's partially a social economic problem, or better yet, a window of opportunity, as Dan was saying. But I think that also it's a very hard problem to solve from a technical perspective, because machine learning, just like anything else, it's a zero-sum problem. So if you serve one group really well, then it's going to be imbalanced towards another group very often. And there's a lot of work that goes into that. And the more that we work on trying to balance any classes in machine learning, is that the problem is going to increasingly become more complex as well. And the more complex a problem is, then we have our bias and variance dilemma, which just basically means that even the best algorithms are going to struggle, and you're going to end up oftentimes having a worse performance maybe on the groups that you are more interested in to start with economically. And all of that kind of plays into things. So if we're going to add in people, for example, who code switch, and this is the case with Spanish speakers in the United States, many of whom were born in the United States, or even several generations in the United States. They're as American as anyone, but they have a cultural background that allows them to code switch. Right.
And by code switch, you mean to change from English to Spanish?
Use Spanish words even in English sentences or entire phrases, or even totally made up words that are not Spanish and they're not English, but something that was created by a new culture. And so that becomes really difficult for speech recognition to deal with, both acoustically and from language models, because they often don't have the data that they need to be able to serve those kinds of problems. And it's harder to classify anyway.
So what's the specific challenges that you really face in trying to build an ASR to support a sort of a broader range of accents? I mean, if you were to, is it much more difficult to start with sort of non-nativeness? Is non-nativeness just like another region, or is it a much broader, much more complicated topic to be able to sort of deal with than just an addition of a regional accent?
Yeah, I mean, it's a math problem for sure. Is that some things can really be generalized. So just because you may use this or that with the wrong phoneme doesn't necessarily mean that the ASR will have any trouble classifying that. But if we really break it down into the types of phenomena that could really be confusing, something like maybe the L&R distinction, the liquids that some Asian cultures face as well, where we can really have ambiguous words that can change meaning very quickly. And looking at those kinds of statistics, getting a clustering of the features that you're really looking at as a machine learning engineer. And oftentimes you can have certain problems that are more apparent that you have to tackle, but of course, then you have to represent them. So you have to first collect data, which is the most important part. And then with that data, you need to, train your model and collect the right data.
So we can obviously work around a number of these problems by just having great data scientists who can build great models. But as you said, it all starts in data. So Dan, if I could bring you in, if it all starts in data and all AI starts in data, then how do you go about approaching building this data set to sort of be inclusive? Like, what are the challenges that people are likely to face, and what's really a good approach they can take that can kind of lead to good outcomes for them?
Well, first of all, plan everything, right? And knowing the audience that you're going to cater to, the people that will be using your application. As I mentioned before, if you're going to create an application that is geared towards the elderly, well, then obviously you're going to want to gather data from elderly people. That will give you the best results. Now, when you're talking about more generic ASR applications, then all of those things that we've mentioned before come into play: age, gender, accent. So at the very least, what we try to do at Find Crowd, whenever we build data sets for our clients, is making sure that we have a almost uniform 50-50 male-female distribution when it comes to gender, that we have people from all age groups, usually a little bit geared heavier towards, let's say, 18 to 35, and then also a little bit diminishing, but also 35 and above up till 60, and then definitely also try to have at least a relevant still. But when you combine this with other parameters like region, then it becomes much more difficult, especially if you're talking about, for instance, going very granular when it comes to regional distribution. Take a look at Portugal, for instance. There's fairly heavily distinction between the north, then Lisbon, the south, the Algarve. They all have different accents. But if you go at a much more granular level, then you can probably say that there is a significant difference between the people from Braga and Porto, even though they're only like, I don't know, 70 kilometers away. Then it becomes more difficult still when you're going to take a look at the islands of Portugal. Much less people there, strong accents often. If you go to the main island, São Miguel, for somebody like me who has a decent command of Portuguese, but not perfect by any means, those people are almost impossible to understand. I'm sure that in the UK, you have those things as well. The Scottish example that you gave from that sketch is a good example. So all those parameters together to get a really perfect overview of an entire group of people, everybody who speaks a certain language, that is very difficult, right? And you're going to have to make some compromises as well. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. So before we get into our next question, let's launch another quick poll and let's see what accent gap is most important to our audience. So from your business perspective, it's like, which accent gap would be most important to your business? And whilst everybody's answering that, let's get on to another question. So Chris, so, you know, when the story breaks, and that's my media background kind of kicking in, you know, that our voice assistant discriminates from people from Hispanic or Latino backgrounds. And, you know, the phone rings in the machine learning department. It's the big boss alongside the director of brand, and they're all going, ah, what's the process that goes through the mind of the engineers and data scientists? It's like, how do you go about fixing this? And really, it's like, what's the quickest turnaround time that you can really do to be able to sort of correct the errors that exist within these biases?
Yeah, I think first of all, the question is there a fix? Because I think to a certain extent, it's our society that's the real problem. So, you know, a really good example that isn't necessarily related to speech, but broke in the news quite a bit, was Wisconsin back a few years ago when they were using AI to help in sentencing. And it was very biased towards especially African Americans, also Latinos, in that, you know, they had a higher disposition to commit another crime or something like that. And is that really the problem of the machine engineer, the machine learning engineer? I'm not sure. I think there's definitely a data problem. And the data that we have, certainly the machine is correct in that the data shows that they are, yes, more likely to commit another crime. But why is that? Is that because our data was created by people who have bias, right? And probably very unduly biased. And so is the problem in our law enforcement? Is the problem in our judicial system? Not really sure, but I think it probably isn't in the machine learning area. But I think that as an engineer, we definitely have to put our hat on in the society as well and look to do good. And when we see that we have data sets that are incredibly unbalanced, imbalanced for some reason or another, then we should definitely try to avoid that when we see that it's definitely going to create damage or something. But then, it's about regulations and that who's penalized when something like that happens. And that's really hard to decide. Is it the machine learning engineer who made the model? Is it the societal organs that created the data? I think it's something that we still have a lot of years to figure out, and we probably need to figure it out sooner than it will probably actually take place.
So, I mean, this raises this issue of sort of ethical implications around this. And we're seeing that a number of governments are now starting to get involved. Our CEOs have been appointed to the sort of the US AI task force over in the US with President Biden. So, and they're looking at these challenges of sort of like, the social impact of AI and what's going to happen with it. But what do you think is the role for regulation within that? Or do you think it's more about policy within companies? It's like, where do we really need to make, in your opinion, the big changes?
Yeah, I think that comes really to regulating. First of all, I think a lot of the big players, and we've started to see a lot of that recently with Google and Microsoft, and there's been some things in the media about how data is used and collected and privacy and things like that. But I think it goes even beyond privacy itself. Is what is it actually being used for? And the law is very fuzzy there. So, once I've collected data, it doesn't really matter where it comes from once it's in a model, right? Because the model is totally binary. It's impossible really to know where the data came from anymore. And it's a really gray area in the law of, can I use that data? What is very well protected is the data itself. So I can't, for example, collect data from a source and say that it's my own data. So if I take it from Jon Snow's website in verbatim, I can't sell it and say, hey, this is my corpus, right? But if I collect from a public open source on the internet and I put that in a model, then how is that regulated? And I think we're still a long ways away from that.
Yeah. Dan, what's your thought about the sort of the ethical implications? I mean, there's, we obviously, we're all good people. We want, we talk about things in the context here of great customer service and stuff like that. But where do you see the more nefarious use cases perhaps coming through?
Well, as with
maybe
almost
not coming through, but the potential to come through.
Yeah. Nefarious use cases. I can think of a couple. There's also, myriads of examples of things that have already happened. I know that a couple of years ago, Microsoft, for instance, they very innocently put a Twitter handle or something out there and said, look, we're going to train a chatbot based on the conversations that are had with this Twitter handle. And within 24 hours, you had the most racist, foul-mouthed bot ever created, right? That was a lesson to be learned for sure. But that's not, this was more of an experiment. So there wasn't really any bad intent behind it. When you're talking about bad intent, and when we're talking about the kinds of data sets that we were talking about here, data sets can be used for good and for bad, as with almost anything. And if you take, for instance, a look at, let's say, a data set of speakers of African American vernacular. We've had some requests for this in the past, and the intent for this data set was absolutely to be recommended. It was to improve speech recognition for African American speakers because the data showed that the ASR systems actually perform worse for African American speakers. So that would be a good use case. Now, obviously, some kinds of data like this, they could also be used to train a model that identifies speakers of African American vernacular and then do things with that data that you don't want to. Typical things that I could think of is call center, where you first speak to an IVR system, and then if it recognizes that you're an African American speaker, it puts you at the end of the queue, for instance, right? So there's all kinds of things that you could do for good as well as bad with data.
I guess it's when we start to combine all these data sets together, right? When we start to combine, socioeconomic data sets along with, these types of demographics, the potential for harm really starts to come through. So I just want to finish off by sort of asking you both one thing then, before we kind of get into our audience's questions. So is starting by addressing non-native English an alternative to sort of global companies who don't really want to build a system for each kind of language of the world and, instead build a global English speech recognition system that understands all non-native English speakers? Would you say that would be a much better approach for them? Obviously not for your sales, Dan.
Well, it probably would help a little bit, right? Because it's going to be very, very difficult to address all possible languages of the world in a very short time frame. You would need a huge amount of resources, probably something that goes beyond the means of even the biggest players in this field, which means that this is going to be an effort that will take a very long time. And in the meantime, something like models that, address non-native speakers of not just English, but some of the more common linguas francas that are out there. So in China, for instance, English might not be the most useful, or in the regions around China, right? Maybe it's Cantonese or it's Mandarin. In the Philippines, where they have thousands and thousands of languages, now slight exaggeration, but let's say hundreds at least, there might be another language that you can focus on that many speakers will be able to speak in such a way that ASR systems can understand them. So to answer your question, I would say that yes, as a stopgap measure, while we build out speech recognition systems for more and more languages, it's probably a good idea to make very robust speech recognition models for some of the major languages so that you are able to address the most people on the globe of this earth, basically on the face of this earth, right? So if you take English, Mandarin, Cantonese, and a couple very select languages, then you probably get a very long way if you make them robust enough to handle non-native speakers.
Okay, great, thanks. So Chris, kind of like almost what's your view a little bit on that? Probably more from a technology. Should we be building for non-native first? Is that a way to sort of like really address this problem? Are there complexities or challenges in the model performances that we get if we adopted that approach?
Yeah, for sure. I think we're going that way with research anyway. We can see very similar approaches in text and big models like transformers, like BERT and others. We see multilingual models and we see monolingual models. I think in the field of ASR and text processing in general, and in NLP field, we see that monolingual models, hybrid models with linguistic knowledge encoded are still much better for most use cases. But we are seeing some really promising results from multilingual and universal embeddings and things like that. that really show that, we need to get there, because that's the difference between a very narrow AI and a much closer to a broad AI. And to be able to do things, to be able to handle generic tasks, and to be able to truly understand what it is, the test that we're doing, and what type of actions need to be taken, rather than, where we've been before with, very narrow scenarios of a chatbot of, I'm a pizza ordering chatbot. The only thing I can do is order pizzas, right? But, if you ask me how to make a sandwich, I have no idea what you're talking about. Or personal assistants on phones, which, we've seen that a lot of these assistants are really, really great kitchen timers, but I can also get a kitchen timer for $1 down at the store, right? So if that really solves my problem, oftentimes I'm not really sure, right? But they're very good at select tasks. And what we need to be able to do is handle with a much larger variety. And I think that really starts with not just non-nativeness, but I think it just starts with being much more general in the data sets that we collect and how we're able to handle them. And technology is far from that, but that's where we're going.
That's great. Okay, so gentlemen, thanks very much for the sort of the discussion. I'd really love to get your opinions on some of the audience questions who've come through. Probably be great to start with you first on this one, Dan. They said they'd love to hear from, this is from Adam, he said he'd love to hear the panelists' experience working with older adults who may have some slurred, slow, or other speech issues.
Yeah, so during a past project, we have worked on this, and yes, there are many speech issues with elderly people. It's not just things like slurred, slow speech, but just the fact that speech in general just changes with age, right? Also, these are not the easiest target group to get data from. Most people don't have as much experience with technology as your average 14-year-old does nowadays, right? Who have grown up with it and are native digital people. For people the age of my parents, for instance, that is definitely not the case. However, you see that more and more age no longer is a deterrent, and people of any age are using all kinds of modern digital applications. So it becomes, I think, a little bit easier to get data from people. They're usually also very eager and interested to, especially when you let them know that you are building something that is catered towards their age group. So where 10 years ago, this might have been a very difficult task to do, I think that nowadays it becomes easier to gather the proper data from elderly speakers.
So that sort of deals, I guess, with some of the data collection. But Chris, what are the sort of the actual model building challenges that are associated with things like slurred, slow, or other speech impediments?
Yeah, for sure. I've actually worked on a project which was related to diagnosing Alzheimer's. It was actually diagnosing the mild impairment that happens before Alzheimer's, which is reversible. And I think the healthcare field is another area that could really be benefited a lot by speech technology. There's a lot of legislation and things that make things difficult. But I think it's an interesting field for sure, and there's a lot of big companies that are investing in it as well. But it's very difficult, and for many of the reasons that Don said, it's hard to collect data because you have to often get patients to sign away to give you data, and they're already going through a very tough time to start with. And you can't start building a model if you don't have data. And the other thing is, a lot of times, like I said, we focus on knowledge that we already have from humans, looking at scholarly articles and trying to figure out what kind of features are useful. And a lot of that is useful, but it's incredible when I did this project how hard it was, because I worked with some of the best doctors in the field, and I asked them, I'm like, what is it? How do you know that someone is, developing Alzheimer's? They're like, oh, well, I know like the first like 2 sentences they say. And you say, okay, well, how do you know? Oh, I don't know. I just know. And it's like, okay, but I kind of need some features here. And after a while, there definitely were some things that pop out, and in the paper that we wrote on it, things like duration of the vowels and pauses and things like that were very predictive as well. But yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to collect data. It's even more of a challenge, even honestly, I know this isn't the question, but for children, because you have to get the consent of adults and things like that. So yeah, I honestly, it's more of a data problem than it is a modeling problem.
Okay, cool. Great, thanks very much. A question from Madhav here. He says, you mentioned about scripted speech. This would be one for Dan. What percentage of speech collection is getting more importance, scripted or unscripted, for training the models?
When it comes to training the models, of course, Chris is our expert, but I think that I can answer this at least to some extent. The scripted speech is much easier to collect. And it also has its importance still nowadays, just for the reason that since it is scripted, you have a pretty good idea of the phonemes that will be generated when people read your text. And that means that you can do things like phonetic balancing, which is very important, because in spontaneous speech, unscripted, those data sets, you might gather hours and hours and hours of data, but there will be phonemes that are terribly underrepresented or even not present at all in your data set. So probably a combination of scripted and unscripted speech is best when it comes to training models. The scripted part, so that you have good coverage of all of the entire language, and the spontaneous part, well, because that is how people speak, and you need spontaneous data in order to be prepared for how people actually will interact with your application.
Great. Anything to add there, Chris? Oh, sorry, I didn't realize you hadn't finished.
To finalize, I think that when I first got started in this field, it was almost 100% scripted, because of the challenges that are inherent to unscripted or spontaneous data collections. But this is a field that has grown tremendously over the last couple of years. The importance of unscripted speech, I think, was always there, but now we are able to gather and to transcribe unscripted speech as well. So now there's a little bit more of balance between the two.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, we'll just go through to Tom's question now. So do you think the accent gap in ASR applications could contribute to the demise of dialects and language variation?
That's a good question.
Who is this for?
Let's give this one to Chris.
Sure. Okay. So I definitely agree, because I think that especially when we talk about using applications and things, is that people see very quickly that if they use more standard languages, that they get better results. And oftentimes I do the same thing, is that I look for forums in English before I do in Portuguese or in German, because there's just a lot more information out there, and the technology is the same. And I also think, for example, here in Portugal, there's definitely a high rejection towards Brazilian Portuguese, but Brazilian Portuguese is the more dominant language for most applications. And so many people, instead of using European Portuguese, they'll just use English, right? Because the results are good. Most people have a fairly good background with English, and they feel more comfortable with it. And so I think, for dialects and idiolects and regionalects, I think it's very similar. People end up changing the way that they speak so that they can interact better with devices, whether it's their home assistants or their cell phones or anything else.
Okay, cool. And another great question, I think it's coming into you here from Mike. It says, can you contrast your frame of reference that puts white native English as the norm within speech recognition efforts engaged in by China and other non-English speaking countries at the forefront of AI?
Don, you want to go?
Um, I'm processing the question still because it's a good one. Our frame of reference that puts white native English as the norm, with speech recognition efforts engaged in by China.
So we all think that like white English is like norm, right? It's like,
Right.
how is that viewed, I guess, in other parts of the world? Is that still seen really as the norm? Or, you know, in these other parts of the world, you know, do they see us as the underrepresented sort of place within this?
Yeah. It's a good question, and it shows the kind of bias that we are, you know, that nobody is free of their own bias, right? For me personally, so I can only speak for myself. Given my experience and the people that I've worked with over the years and the companies that I've worked with over the years, the main bias that we are trying to combat, so to speak, is the bias that privileges the white male 18 to 35-year-old. However, it might very well be that that is perhaps not the most important one to address. In China, I'm sure that they are spending billions and billions of money into all kinds of tech endeavors, but it's traditionally been a market that is not very easy to penetrate in, or to, from my experience at least, to understand exactly what is going on there and what kinds of biases live there, etc. So perhaps I'm not the best person to answer this question. I don't have a lot of experience with speech recognition in China, what kinds of biases they have there. I don't know if Chris has something more meaningful to contribute.
Yeah, what was your experience from your time in Brazil, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, you know, working for Asian companies as well, is that there are players that work in that space. There's definitely a technology gap between American companies and non-American companies, for sure. And also, the United States still undeniably has a very strong GDP as a proportion to their population. And I think that we see China, for example, as a great example of a country that definitely has caught up a lot in recent times. And there are a lot of really excellent players who are putting Chinese as their, or Mandarin and other languages as their focus. And we've seen a lot of improvement. But I think that still, there is a gap between the technology that's available for English and the technology that's available for Chinese.
Yeah. And then we've got another great question that's coming from Mark here. It says, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being low, 10 being high, what is the awareness among the speech recognition geeks on the privacy issues with IVR systems collecting personal information from customers? Does this limit the improvement of speech recognition systems? So I guess I could probably start by answering this one and say, you know, most of our customers, they come to us because they can't collect data from their own customers. So, you know, what we do is we actually have an IVR platform, and we have sort of, you know, we use our crowd to be able to call in, and we train them against various phrases to simulate IVR conversations. And that's how the speech recognition models for within IVR generally tend to be trained within the industry. I think it's quite rare that any kind of live collection of customer data really goes on. I mean, I don't know, Dan, if you've got anything to add on that?
No, I think that well, just perhaps a tiny thing, you've explained it pretty well. At least within our industry, or at least with people that I have experience with, the awareness is very, very high, right? Because first of all, it's the right thing to do, to be mindful of people's privacy. And secondly, there are huge fines when it comes to breaches in privacy. So awareness is very high, and you explained it well. This is exactly why we do some of the types of data collections that we do, that simulate this kind of data without having actual personally identifiable information. On the other
Yeah.
hand, we have already had a couple of cases where it's rare, you mentioned that correctly, but we have had cases where there was some data that had PII in it, and that has to be handled extremely carefully. It cannot be, it's definitely not going through the same kinds of crowd processes as normal data for us goes. So that has to be handled with extreme sensitivity.
Specific servers as well.
Yes.
European data can't leave Europe.
Exactly. So overall, I would say that the awareness is very, very high.
Yeah, I would generally say that when we get speech collection jobs or any jobs that may involve PII, it's head in hands moment, and that, like, you know, it's unbelievably difficult to be able to work through and do those types of collections, because, you know, when it comes to PII, anything less than 100% is like just unacceptable. And that, you know, it's GDPR is not forgiving of that in that kind of regard. So the awareness is actually generally quite high. You know, we are aware of that, and that is actually why, you know, most of the biggest companies in the world come and use companies such as ours to be able to do their data collections for them and to be able to sort of train their models. Okay, what else do we have? Question here from Andrea. In data collections on your side, how do you collect data when it comes to not so much tech-affine social groups? We face problems with speakers with migration background that cannot easily be reached over internet channels.
That is a very good question. And unfortunately, the answer is that, at least in my experience, our clients, they usually build applications for people who are tech savvy, or at least to some extent, and who have exposure and who have the economic means to buy devices and applications, etc., that that address these issues. So we've already addressed some of the question when it comes to the elderly speakers, for instance. There's definitely some progress there. Right now, when it comes to people that cannot easily be reached over internet channels, it is difficult. Not going to lie, it is not something that has had a lot of focus. It is definitely an area that merits a lot more attention, but it's not something that I've seen personally addressed in a meaningful way so far.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. Last question probably for you, Chris, which is, how is code switching being addressed at the moment? What are the next steps to improve code switching recognition?
Yeah, Ruth, that's a really good question. And I don't know if I have a really good answer, but I'll try. But you know, I think that we're still making the shift, as I said before, between very monolingual and monodomain focused models into broader domains and dealing with multiple languages at the same time. And we're still a ways away from that. But in general, the way I've dealt with it in the past is generally a mix between acoustic modeling and language modeling. Is as long as you have some representation of a good baseline acoustic model, it really becomes a language modeling problem, and that's usually where you can solve most problems in this regard. So when there's vocabulary that you expect from a certain group that you believe is going to actually use your application and are probably going to use certain phrases that will be useful, then it's, you know, smart to make sure that that's well represented in your model. But I would say that it's still very much an endeavor of feature engineering rather than always a data-driven process. And I think it's mainly just because it's hard to collect the data that you really need and to build a model that can handle it. But yeah, I would love to continue working in this and finding really nifty solutions as well.
Thanks very much, Chris. Before we go, I'd like to let our audience know that we actually have a very cool article as well about preventing bias in speech technology. We'll actually post that into the Zoom chat, and we'll also follow up when we send out a live recording of the video as well, with a link to that article as well. That also has a link to the free data set that's available for you. You know, unfathomable generous, $1,000 worth of data. It is actually, you know, it's enough to really have a good project where you can start to work and you can start to explore the performance difference of models between accents. So it's a really good giveaway, especially if you're really kind of like passionate about solving these problems. So please don't forget that we have a data marketplace where you can find all the off-the-shelf training data sets to be able to sort of test and train your AI models. All of it ethically sourced. None of it secretly recorded from people's phone calls. And, you know, we have detailed metadata with that, really good demographics so you can understand the breakdown of that as well. Registration is completely free. You know, you only ever pay for the data sets that you download. Now, the 9 hours you've got is free. So please go to the site. It is getdata.definecrowd.com. And finally, we would just love if you could answer our poll that tells you what you thought about this webinar. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you all here. It's been a pleasure having our panelists and having them answer your questions as well. Some great questions in there. Some of the stuff to really sort of dwell on and address our own unconscious biases that really exist. But it's really been a pleasure. So I'd like to say thank you all very much, and hopefully you'll tune into the next webinar that we host as well, where we'll be exploring a different topic within this kind of world of AI as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Good to see you all.